Welcome to the Expert Talks Executive Corner by Kalkine TV. I'm Sage, and today's guest is Jamie Meyer, the founder and head specialist of business at 9 Carat Business Consulting. And with the pandemic restrictions causing many businesses to have to pivot and find alternative strategies and alliances, business consultancy has come into the spotlight. And 9 Carat Business Consulting redesigns businesses as an enriched and multidimensional framework. They invigorate or reinvigorate businesses, their foundations, futures and approach to progress. So we'll find out more soon. And as you know, we bring you the industry advocates and business leaders all under the one roof to help you discover the insights of the stock markets. And bringing you live today, we have Jamie Meyer, founder and head specialist of business at 9 Carat Business Consulting. Welcome to the show, Jamie.
Thank you for having me, Sage. It's a pleasure. I mean, I'm not sure I need to talk. That introduction was pretty amazing, all in itself. So thank you for that.
That was just the drum roll. We're keen to hear your insights, Jamie. So according to you, what's the one fundamentally more sophisticated way of thinking about business that transcends limitations?
I'm pretty sure I only have 10 minutes and I cannot thoroughly answer that question in an all-encompassing way in 10 minutes. But a very short version is first to recognize that sophistication does not necessarily equate to complexity. The second is that limitations are set by our attitudes and ideas of what business is or should be, and then what we should be within business within that space. And thirdly, I think that thinking about business as though it is not a lifeless entity, but rather an ecosystem that requires animation and substance. And this is something that's possible when we consider that business isn't solely reliant on a level of exterior investment, but an investment and interaction of people, of both those within that business and outside of it.
That's so true. Thank you for summing that up in a nutshell. You've really broken down a complex idea into something that's a lot more understandable and manageable. So how can businesses move towards achieving a sustainable practice in their success, in your opinion?
That's a difficult one to answer in such a broad capacity, because I do believe that the actual answer to that question is very specific depending on businesses. So businesses are as an individual as people are, and to try and say that there's one way to achieve that is probably not a recommendation that I have. But depending on the size and level of current success of a business, I think that sustainable success is based more on having an unshakable foundation. And an unshakable foundation is something that's constructed when you have your long-term goals in mind when you were actually starting it. So a lot of people have, they start a business and they have this small idea of what it's going to look like, and then try and scale it with that same small foundation, and it kind of becomes like Jenga and things start falling all over the place and it gets wobbly. So unshakable foundation, and then understanding the velocity and capacity that you have from that foundation that you've created and where you need to make adjustments to it to go further.
Great. Thanks so much for sharing your insights. And I think you're so right about saying that there's no one copy-paste, one-fits-all solution for every business. It is so specific, and depending on business goals and business needs, it varies. So could you please give us your expert opinion on how businesses should align their relations, interactions and environments synergistically?
I think all of those things are hinged on understanding, clarity and communication of the values and motivations of any one business, and then how everything that you do and everybody that you come into contact with contributes to that vision and why. I think that a great disconnect between any kind of synergy is the fact that we don't have a thorough idea of what we're trying to achieve, or we're not communicating in a way that people understand what they're contributing to. When people understand the impact that their actions have and the impact that they can potentially achieve, then there's a higher level of synergy that's available no matter what the dynamic of the business.
Wow, thank you so much for sharing your insights there. I had a experience recently which seemed like a good example of synergy. I don't know if you would agree, but I had seen a business advertising something about how tech is affecting the HR department or HR industry. I downloaded that thinking it would be an interesting document to read and maybe invite them on the show. They then called me to see if I needed an update to my HR services here in the office. So I found that synergistic. Would you think that's the business ecosystem working in a mutually beneficial manner?
I suppose it depends if that emailed it or not.
We can come back to that some other time.
I mean, if it's automated, no. If somebody actually understood what they were sending to you, then yes.
Okay, so potentially, all right. They haven't actually signed up for coming onto Expert Talks yet, but I'm still working on it.
Okay, well, good luck with that. I mean, hopefully it is synergistic.
Yeah. So back on the mainline discussion now, could you please talk about business strategies to watch out for in 2022?
I honestly think that that's going to depend on how people have been affected by COVID. There's a number of different ways. The beautiful thing about COVID is that it has opened people's eyes to breaking some of the myths that have been told about business for 40 odd years. Whether people decide to throw their hands in the air and not know what to do because their idea of business has been shattered, or whether they decide to actually step into a new ideal or model of what business can be. I think if they decide to not shift, then nothing will change. There'll be quite a substantial amount of businesses that continue to struggle to either recover from COVID or understand that there's going to be shifts in the market. I think one of those biggest shifts is the idea of remote work. I think that the idea of business can be restructured, and there will be considered restructuring based on the idea that you can access a greater pool of talent, having a remote foundation rather than expecting everybody to be within living distance or driving distance of a premises. And I think that the other biggest thing is that companies now have a really great opportunity to listen to people. I think that, something about remote work in the past has been quite a faux pas because we cannot be micromanaged and we don't have people physically at work where we can enforce and restrict the way that they work every day. And I'm hoping that companies are realizing that in environments where people thrive, they're happy in, and granted lockdown isn't necessarily a choice that people have enjoyed, but it is more of an environment that they choose to be in every day. So the level of productivity and investment and the quality of integration for those companies will have elevated. So I think that there's a big shift into remote work. I think that structurally that will be the biggest change for businesses in 2022, and understanding the way to now capitalize on those kinds of restructures.
Great. Wow. Thanks so much for sharing the insights on that. And it's interesting to see how many businesses have reduced their carbon footprint by not having to do all the business travel and instead just use the video conferencing instead. So it'll be interesting to see how many stick to that strategy instead of the travel option. And the other one is, I think I heard Facebook saying that they're keen to get people back in the office because the level of innovation is actually a lot less now that people aren't getting their heads together and talking about things in person and instead doing it all online. They're finding that it's actually not helping much, so they're keen to get people back in the office. But lastly, Jamie, how is the consulting business in Australia been from your experience and around the pandemic? What have you noticed?
This is a hard one because usually when we go into a recession, that's the perfect time for a company to start working on itself. When they're busy and the economy is booming, companies tend not to have the time to look into those avenues and fix holes because they're so busy just facilitating growth or market share. So a usual recession, you would see an increase in consulting in Australia. I think that it hasn't necessarily been difficult, but it's been environment to navigate. A lot of companies have been closed, legitimately closed, so had no options to work or facilitate business for themselves at all, and not at any point had any idea of when that would resume for them. So bringing in a consultant in those instances is probably not a decision a lot of people made. It would have probably been a healthy one to make, because they could have explored different ways to then bring them back into business, even within the limitations of lockdowns. And then you've got the other side of it, where companies did actually either had a skeleton crew or were concerned about how they were going to navigate the different landscape that COVID introduced, and they heavily invested in consulting. So I think that if you were a business in 2021, you definitely should have invested in a consultant, and the companies that did, I think they thrived the quickest.
Great. Thank you so much for making time for the show today. Your insights were so valuable, and I hope you enjoyed our discussion.
Pleasure, Sage. Thanks so much for having me.
And if you've just joined us, we just had a very interesting discussion with Jamie Meyer, the founder and head of business at 9 Carat Business Consulting. And the full interview is available at YouTube at Kalkine Media's site. So please check out our page. And please do keep watching Kalkine TV for more live expert talks, market updates. You know what we're good for. And as we say, stay apprised and invest wise with Kalkine.